we can get away with it. Peter?
Thank you very much, Dr. Iribertus, and thank you for moderating under such short notification. So I'll run through this briefly, and maybe, I don't know if they're going to go back to the live case shortly thereafter. It was an interesting question that we looked at from our own database as to whether or not deviating from the IFU is going to make a significant difference in outcomes. So these are my disclosures. So adherence with the IFU has been reported to be low. I think if we looked at Andy Shanzer's study as sort of the largest that examined this question, and really between 42 and 69% of the cases performed were not done within IFU, so probably more than half. And other studies have further confirmed these findings. And it's not clear what the effect of these non-adherence, if you will, to the IFU is. So we look at our own study population from Mount Sinai between 2003 and 2014. These are all with commercially available grafts. They had to have appropriate imaging in order to be analyzed within the study. Adherence to the IFU was determined, and then determined what the specific non-adherent areas were. In other words, was it aortic angulation, diameter, was it iliac tortuosity or calcification, et cetera. Primary endpoints were all-cause mortality and aneurysm-related mortality. And secondary endpoints were late rupture, need for reintervention, endoleaks, sac enlargement, and operative complications. 900 patients were treated with commercially fabricated grafts during that time period. Patients with ruptured aneurysms were excluded. Those had stent grafts for other reasons, whether it be thoracic or juxtarenal aneurysms, pseudoaneurysms, penetrating ulcers, et cetera, were excluded. Reinterventions were excluded, and then if they didn't have adequate imaging for analysis. This left a total of 566 patients that were analyzed. This very busy, small font slide is basically showing all the devices that were utilized or were examined in this study, and the number and percentage that were within or outside of the instructions for use. And then the overall number is, I suppose, not surprising for those that are familiar with our aortic practice. Only 31% were within the instructions for use, and the remaining nearly 70% were outside of the IFU. Oops, and so that just highlights that. Again, another busy slide looking at the demographics of these patients, and there was no significant difference in terms of any of the comorbidities or other demographic characteristics for patients treated within the instructions for use and those treated outside of the instructions for use. When we looked at the instructions for use, the specific criteria, they included proximal aortic neck diameter, and the percentage that adhered to the instructions for use was high in the aortic neck diameter. It was 82%. In terms of neck length, 82% again were within the instructions for use. When you look at angulation, just over 90% were within the instructions for use. When we look at iliac fixation length or iliac sealing zone, almost 96% of patients. But when we look at iliac diameters, only 49% of patients were treated within the IFU. And so if you look at that overall number, it was that 31% that was cited initially. We then looked at the results with respect to all-cause mortality and then aneurysm-related mortality, which is probably more relevant or more sensitive for this study population. And there was no difference in either all-cause mortality or aneurysm-related mortality, whether the patient was treated within the IFU or outside of the IFU. And I think that's depicted here. It's a non-significant p-value, and here it is depicted in a life table analysis. So the life table analysis is comparing those treated outside the IFU as the blue line, those treated within the instructions for use as the red line, and you can see there's a remarkable mortality trend. These are all pretty much high-risk patients, so the overall mortality is quite high in this patient population, but there's no difference between those treated inside or outside of the instructions for use. And again, probably more relevant is looking at aneurysm-related mortality. Again, the blue line are those outside of the IFU, the red line those treated within the IFU, and no difference between those two groups on this life table analysis. When looking at secondary outcomes, the only secondary outcome that had any variation between the two cohorts was the need for transfusion. So all their endpoints or complications, either intraoperative complications, the presence of endo leak, need for perioperative complications or longer length of stay, those all were demonstrated no significant difference between the two groups. The only significant difference was need for transfusion, which was higher in patients treated outside the IFU in this single center study. And when looking at late outcomes, no difference, again, in any of the late outcomes that were examined were present between these two groups, including late aneurysm rupture, which is extremely limited in both groups, any endograft complications, need for reintervention, and any type of endo leak. Again, no difference between those groups, and consequently no difference in sac shrinkage or enlargement. And here's that, again, depicted on a life table analysis. Again, no difference in the two curves between those treated within the IFU and outside. When we look at freedom from type 1 and type 3 endo leaks, as was depicted on the table, this life table analysis just confirms again, type 1 and type 3 endo leaks outside the IFU are the blue line, within the IFU is the red line, and again, no difference on that analysis. And similarly, no difference in freedom from reintervention. Almost start to see a trend toward increased reintervention in those treated within the IFU. So the red line are those treated within the IFU. But when looking at the overall life table on log-rank analysis, there is no significant difference between those two curves. Finally, when we look at a sub-analysis looking just at proximal neck length and proximal neck angulation. Now, I would just refer back, the percentage of patients treated within the IFU for these two parameters was over 80%. So the great majority of patients actually in this sub-analysis were within the IFU, and so a more limited number of patients outside the IFU. But if you look at all-cause mortality and aneurysm-related mortality, still no difference whether you're inside or outside the IFU in that component of the patient population. So let me conclude by saying adherence to the instructions for use anatomic criteria during EVAR is limited, and our study further demonstrated that. In the current study, extending utilization of endografts beyond the IFU did not have a negative impact on survival, intraoperative complications, endo leaks, or reintervention. Further analysis of the impact of adherence to the IFU criteria during EVAR will be necessary to determine the ultimate parameters for intervention. And again, I would just remind the audience that the majority of these patients treated outside the IFU were because of iliac anatomy. So thank you very much, and I guess we're going to the next talk. Are there questions?